I never really thought much about this house while I was living in it. The events, they only started to feel significant years later, when I reviewed them as a sequence rather than as isolated events. Between 2008 and 2012, my family lived in a single-story rental home on the outskirts of Wichita Falls, Texas. I was 16 when we moved in, and the house was pretty ordinary. Narrow hallway, 3 bedrooms, low ceilings, older carpet, and a little bit of poor lighting here and there. From the first few months onward, there were minor disturbances that none of us treated seriously at the time. These included unexplained sounds at night, brief movement detected in peripheral vision, and the general sense that someone else was present even when the house was empty. Most of these incidences were easy to dismiss individually. Houses make noises, peripheral vision is unreliable, teenagers are suggestible. That was the working explanation for a long time. One afternoon, though, my younger brother and I were standing in the hallway outside of our bedrooms. My room was directly across from my mother's, and we both saw what appeared to be a human figure move from my doorway into my mother's room. The movement was smooth and deliberate, weirdly smooth in fact, not really consistent with somebody walking. The figure was visible from the shoulders down, and there was no visible head or facial detail. The body passed fully into the room and didn't re-emerge. We checked both rooms immediately, but no one was there. When we told our mother, she didn't react with surprise. She said that she had noticed similar things before and told us not to focus on it. Her response suggested that she had already normalized the experiences and didn't want to escalate it into something frightening, I guess. And at the time, that reassurance was enough for us. Several months later, we spoke with a neighbor at one point who had lived on the street for decades, and during a casual conversation about the house, she asked whether we had noticed anything unusual about it. She said that the previous tenants had reported odd occurrences, apparently. She then mentioned that a former resident, a guy named Harold, had died by suicide in the early 1980s, using a firearm in what was now my mother's bedroom. We did not confirm these through records or anything, and it remained just sort of secondhand information, but still, it provided a narrative explanation that we casually sort of adopted. And so, from then on, whenever something minor happened, a noise, a door shifting, something falling, we always referred to it as Harold without taking it seriously. It became a way to sort of reduce tension rather than increase it, I suppose, but the more disruptive events happened later and only ever at night. So on multiple occasions, I woke up with this sensation that my body was moving downward off of the bed. This was not a falling sensation and not a dream involving motion or anything. I was fully conscious during the later instances of this, and my legs would be extended beyond the mattress, feet touching the floor while my upper body remained on the bed. The movement, it was always slow and steady, as if force was being applied evenly from below. There was no sensation of hands or gripping pressure or anything. It felt more like a force rather than physical. Now, I'm a pretty large person, over 6 feet tall, at the time at least, and I weighed a fair bit as well, so moving my body in that way would require significant force or leverage. When I became fully alert, the movement, it always stopped as well. I would stand up, turn on the light, and find nothing displaced in the room, and no signs of slipping, no bedding disturbed in a way that explained the motion. And this was certainly not a one-off event too. This occurred several times over the span of months. Eventually too, my emotional reaction to the whole thing sort of diminished. It became irritating rather than frightening. I never really reported it to anyone, partly because I didn't want to reinforce the narrative that we had created, and partly because I could not explain it clearly and I thought people would think that I was crazy. The situation changed though when my brother had a friend stay over one night. The friend had heard the stories about the house and dismissed them openly. and late that night, while we were all in separate rooms, he loudly stated that he didn't believe in ghosts and directed a sort of mocking comment toward the idea of Harold, using confrontational language. And at about 3 a.m, I was awakened by screaming. It was immediate, loud, and continuous. Everyone in the house woke up. My mother reached the room first, with me right behind her, and the friend was visibly distressed and struggling to explain what happened. He said that he woke up while being pulled toward the edge of the bed and regained full awareness just before falling off. He was shaking and refused to stay in the room alone afterward. The next morning, I told my mother and brother about my own experiences. The details matched closely enough that the conversation ended pretty quickly. No one tried to rationalize it any further, and I think everybody knew that there was something wrong. We continued living in that house for another year after that. The incidences never went away, but they didn't escalate either. Eventually, we moved out, and none of us experienced anything similar in subsequent homes. No one pursued formal investigation, and no records were checked to verify the neighbor's claim or anything. And so, because of that, I cannot verify anything, but once we left that house, the pattern ended, and for that, I am very grateful. So I worked night shifts at a logistics company, and so my schedule was completely inverted at the time, sleeping during the day and awake at night. One night at around 2:45 in the morning, 3 of us decided to ride out on our motorcycles to grab some food from a 24-hour food place about maybe 40 miles from my apartment. The route included a long stretch of road passing an old, mostly unused cemetery on the outskirts of the city. There are only a few scattered houses along that stretch too, and the cemetery itself is fenced off but also accessible at a small side gate, used occasionally by maintenance workers from what I could see. The road is narrow, poorly lit, and usually deserted at that hour. Up to that night, we had driven the stretch dozens of times without any incident, but while approaching the cemetery gate, 2 of us, including myself, noticed a woman standing about maybe 3 meters from the edge of the road, facing us. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing a dark-colored sari with her hair tied back. Her posture was completely still. She didn't seem to react to our headlights. The first thing that I noticed was not her expression, a faint, almost neutral smile, not warm and not hostile, but just enough to suggest awareness, I would guess, but it was the way that she was standing. She maintained direct eye contact with us the whole time, even as we passed. We slowed slightly, but we didn't stop, and the road was pretty narrow, and I was concerned about safety more than anything else, but during that brief time that it took to pass her, she didn't move, speak, or gesture, or anything. It was an extremely brief interaction, maybe 10 to 12 seconds I would say, but the image of her face stayed with me. Even now, months later, I can recall the sharp features and the calm expression clearly. Well, after passing, we discussed what we had seen. 2 of us were certain that she was there, but the other 2 riders seemed distracted and didn't react at all at the time. I assumed that they had seen her as well, but a few hours later, one of them admitted that he didn't remember seeing anyone at all, and the 4th rider had no memory of anything unusual either. And that discrepancy, it troubled me more than the sighting itself. We considered a lot of explanations, but the details just didn't fit. She was standing there in an isolated area where no one would normally wait. The cemetery was closed, and there was no obvious way for her to have appeared there unnoticed. She didn't carry a bag or any items, and there was no evidence of someone nearby assisting her. After that night, I avoided that stretch alone for quite some time. I also spoke with a few night shift colleagues who occasionally used the same route, asking if they had ever seen anything similar near that cemetery. A couple said that they had sometimes felt uneasy passing it late at night, but no one had reported seeing a figure or anything else. I don't know what or who she was or why she was even there. I considered that it might have been a local practicing some sort of a ritual or something, maybe waiting for a ride, but her stillness, like a statue, and direct gaze, and the timing of it all made those possibilities seem really unlikely. Plus the fact that some of us saw her and others didn't. And what's more puzzling is that 2 of us saw her and others didn't. I still think about that night a lot too. The incident is over a year old now and nothing similar has ever occurred. I even go past that place sometimes. I always remain alert and cautious in that section near the cemetery now, though. For me, the most unsettling part is the memory of a person just sort of standing there motionless in an isolated area without any explanation, and obviously the fact that not everybody saw her. That inconsistency is what I find most difficult to rationalize. So I undertook a long-distance walking route in southern Spain sometime back in 2021. It loosely followed sections of an old rural pilgrimage trail, and it was not an officially maintained route or anything, and large sections passed through agricultural land as well, scrub forest and low mountain ranges even. I completed the trip alone, carrying a tent and supplies, and covered just over 1,000 kilometers over the course of several months. Now, most nights were spent camping outdoors. I alternated between riversides, olive groves, forested hills, and higher elevation terrain. Noise at night was pretty normal and predictable. Even in remote areas, there were always indicators of life: insects, wind through trees, dogs in distant villages, or small animals moving through brush. Over time, these sounds became background information rather than a source of concern. One night, though, stands out as an exception. It occurred roughly 6 weeks into the walk, in a mountainous area north of Cordoba, at an elevation where farms are sparse and access roads were pretty limited. I had climbed steadily for most of the afternoon, and had not encountered another person for hours at this stage. Mobile reception? It dropped out well before sunset, and so I selected a campsite slightly off the trail on a wooded slope, far enough from the path to avoid visibility, but close enough to continue easily in the morning. There was nothing unusual during the setup. No signs of nearby camps, no voices, no vehicle sounds. I ate, organized my gear, and went to sleep as usual. I must have woken up sometime between 1:30 and 2 in the morning, which was normal for me while camping, to be honest. But what was not normal was the complete absence of, any ambient sound. What I mean is that there was no wind, no insects, no movement in the trees. The silence was not gradual either, it was total. Even in rural areas, there is typically some low-level noise at least, but this was different enough that it immediately registered as really weird. I stayed still and listened. The only things that I could perceive were internal sounds, my breathing and a faint ringing in my ears. I did not hear footsteps, animals, or any indication that something external had caused the silence. I noticed that the darkness felt unusually complete though, likely due to the heavy tree cover, I suppose, and the lack of moonlight that night. But at the time, it certainly added to the sense of disorientation. I didn't check my phone or turn on a headlamp immediately. I wanted to avoid losing night vision and preferred to assess whether anything changed naturally. I remained awake for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and during that entire period, there was no change in sound levels. No wind developed, no animals resumed movement, nothing approached or retreated or anything. It was just completely silent, and the silence persisted consistently. But eventually I heard this really weird sort of humming sound. It seemed to be coming from above my tent somewhere, but it was like a really sort of low humming noise. Hard to describe, but that's the best that I can do. And then, all I remember next is waking up in the morning. From a rational standpoint, I guess you could say that maybe it was just a sudden drop in the wind, a lull in animal activity or something. Maybe the temperature changed. But none of these fully explain the duration of the completeness of the silence for me. But they certainly remained the most plausible possibility. They also didn't really explain that weird humming sound that I heard. Mind you, there was no sense of immediate danger or anything, but there was a strong feeling of alertness, I guess you could say, as if my body was responding to a situation that it just really couldn't contextualize. Anyway, the next morning, conditions were normal. The birds were active, insects were present, and there were no visible signs of disturbances around the campsite. I packed up and sort of continued walking, and I passed through a small village later that day and asked casually about wildlife or unusual activity in the area. The response was pretty unremarkable, to be honest. Over the remainder of the trip, I experienced no similar events either. Nights returned to their usual patterns of intermittent noise and movement, and that single night remains the only time during the journey when I felt genuine unease. Also, and I don't know if this is related, but when I was walking, I sort of got itchy down on my leg at some point, and when I went to scratch it and take a look at it, I sat down on a rock to take a drink and take a look at it, and that's when I noticed that I had this weird scar there that I swear wasn't there before. The best way that I can describe it is that it's like a sort of weird divot in my ankle, or sort of in my shin, I guess you could say. I know that it wasn't there beforehand, and maybe I hurt myself somewhere along the way and didn't notice or something, but I swear that it wasn't there like the day before, or at the very least a few days before that. I really don't know how to explain any of this, and I still think about it occasionally, mostly not because of everything that happened, but I have very fond memories of that trek, and it was a really amazing experience that I had out there. Again, I don't really know what to make of much of this, and I don't really have any conclusions as to what this all is, but if you have any ideas as to what this might have been, then I would love to hear from you. Thanks. I am employed at a second-hand furniture and collectible shop in northern England, located in a small commercial strip with several neighbouring businesses. The building, it dates back to the early 1900s and has been renovated multiple times. I mention this for context, and while I'm generally a skeptical person of paranormal explanations and tend to assume that there's a practical cause for most unusual events, this one I've had some trouble explaining. So this incident occurred in early November of 2023, during normal business hours, shortly after midday. The store was moderately busy but not crowded that day. There were 2 customers browsing independently, and 1 customer near the counter with a dog on a leash. The dog was medium-sized and appeared calm when it entered. As the owner paused to examine an item near a display cabinet, I bent slightly toward the dog and said a quiet greeting. It was spoken sort of reflexively in a low, informal tone that people often use when addressing animals. The volume was minimal and not intended to carry beyond a few feet. But immediately after I finished speaking, without any noticeable delay, there was a second voice that repeated the same phrase. This second voice was significantly louder and clearly audible across the store. It matched my voice closely in pitch, pacing, and intonation, but the sound just didn't resemble a reflection or an echo or anything. It appeared to originate from somewhere behind me or just off to the side of me, but not from the direction that I was facing. My co-worker, who was approximately 4 meters away organizing stock, reacted instantly. She looked toward me and commented on how abruptly I had raised my voice. She had not heard my initial quiet remark at all and assumed the louder phrase was deliberate. When I told her that I had not spoken the second time, she initially seemed confused rather than alarmed. Now, to rule out any obvious explanation, I asked her directly whether she had said it or played a recording as a bit of a joke. This would have been inconsistent with her behavior and work habits for sure, and she denied it without hesitation. She also confirmed that no one else was positioned behind me or near the aisle, at least to the rear of me, at that moment. The customer with the dog had their back turned and didn't react verbally, but the dog became noticeably unsettled immediately after the sound occurred. It pulled slightly at the leash and stopped making eye contact with me. This reaction stood out to me as well because the animal had been calm seconds earlier and even seemed excited to see me. Now, my phone was in my locker in the back room and not on my person. The store speaker system was playing music continuously, and there was no interruption or volume change at all. The speakers are ceiling mounted anyway and distributed evenly, and I can assure you that the sound didn't come from them. The room itself is acoustically dull due to heavy furniture and fabric items here. Voices just don't really carry that sharply, and there's no noticeable reverberation anywhere or anything. Well, after the incident, my coworker and I sort of walked to the floor to check for possible sources of how this could have happened. No other customers were within speaking distance, and no electronic devices were active besides the music system. Nothing really unusual was found. But while this event was isolated, it was not occurring in a vacuum for sure, because multiple staff members, including myself, have previously noticed unexplainable sounds or objects moving in the store at times. In one documented instance, a ceramic item fell from a shelf laterally rather than forward, despite no visible contact or vibration. That event was even captured on security footage, which we reviewed carefully at the time. And no clear cause was identified, but we didn't escalate it further because we just didn't know what to do about it. Despite these prior occurrences too, I'm still hesitant to assign meaning beyond, well, uncertainty, I guess you could say. Human perception is imperfect, I know that, and short phrases, especially familiar ones, can be mislocalized or misinterpreted or something. Stress, expectations, and environmental noise all can affect perception as well, I know that. But what makes this event difficult to dismiss entirely is the sequencing. The repetition occurred immediately after my own speech, before there was time for conscious processing or response. And the fact that only the louder version was perceived by my coworker suggests that the two sounds were not identical, even if they were verbally the same. Again, I'm not claiming that this is paranormal or anything. As I said at the start, I'm a bit of a skeptic for the most part, but I'm also not satisfied with any of the explanations that I've currently got. And I guess my concern is not like fear for my life or anything, but just lack of a clear explanation that accounts for all of the details without contradiction. For that reason too, I continue to treat this as an unexplained but isolated anomaly rather than evidence of anything broader, but still, I really don't know what to make of it. I was young enough at the time that I was still restrained in a Busta seat, likely no older than 4, I would say. But the memory, well, it is fragmented and lacks clear chronology, which I am aware affects the reliability. But what I do recall most clearly is not the visual detail, but the sequence and the sound of things, which I'm pretty much 100% certain that I remember clearly. So, this occurred in the late 1990s in western Pennsylvania, on a 2-lane overpass that crossed a shallow river near an industrial area. My mother was driving, and a co-worker of hers was in the passenger seat. The traffic was moving steadily, but not fast that day, and at some point, my mother slowed abruptly and pulled onto the shoulder near the midpoint of the bridge. Other vehicles continued to pass us as well. From my position in the back seat, I could see that something had drawn her attention to the pedestrian side of the bridge. I didn't understand the situation, only that the atmosphere inside the car changed immediately. My mother exited the vehicle, though. Her co-worker turned around, unbuckled me, and lifted me out of the seat without explanation. That alone signaled that something was wrong. On the sidewalk side of the bridge railing stood an older woman, positioned on the outside of the barrier. She was gripping the metal with one hand, and I remember her posture more than her face. She was angled outward, not toward the traffic. And what stands out in my memory is the presence of two additional women near the railing. Both appeared elderly. They were calm and spoke quietly, not to us but to the woman beyond the barrier. I could hear fragments of what they said. Their tone was reassuring and their speech was slow and measured. I don't remember exact wording, but only the implication that they were attempting to persuade her to come back over the railing. At the time, I didn't interpret this as an emergency in an adult sense. I only registered that something serious was happening and that the voices that I heard reduced my panic. I pressed my face into the shoulder of the person holding me and avoided looking at the scene directly. Emergency services arrived shortly afterward, and I remember the sound of the sirens and the reflection of the lights against the metal railings. At that point, my memory becomes unclear, and I don't know how the situation was resolved, whether the woman was safely removed, or how long my mother remained out of the vehicle. But years later, as an adult, I brought up the incident in conversation with my mother one day. I asked her if she remembered stopping on the bridge when I was very young, and she did. Her recollection matched mine in pretty much broad terms: the location, the woman on the wrong side of the railing, and her decision to stop. However, when I asked about the two older women who were speaking to the distressed woman, my mother was confused. She said that there had been no one else present when she approached. According to her, she and her co-worker were the only people who stopped before the police arrived. I initially assumed that she had forgotten, but she was firm on this point. She stated that there was only one woman at the railing and no one standing with her. What complicated any explanations that we came up with, too, is that my recollection of those voices, it occurs before the arrival of sirens and emergency personnel, and that they were localized to the railing area, not the roadway. We sat down and spoke about it for some time, trying to figure out what the heck happened that day, but I just sort of came away from that conversation more confused than ever. I remember those women clear as day, and I really just don't know what to make of this. I did not expect to question my assumptions about unexplained events when we bought this place. The house, it's at an end of road terrace. The house is an end-of-road terrace construction in the late 19th century, located in Leeds, England. We moved here in early of 2024. The age of the building was initially a point of humor between my partner and me. We both consider ourselves rational and generally dismissive of paranormal stuff, although we do find the topic interesting in an abstract sense, but the first incident occurred roughly 8 weeks after moving in. We have a bit of a routine of lighting a scented candle in the bathroom during the evening, and we use it while getting ready for bed and make a point of extinguishing it fully before leaving the room. This is not casual or rushed or anything. One of us always confirms that the flame is out and that the wick has stopped glowing. One morning we entered the bathroom and we found the same candle burning. There was no sign of wax overflow, no scorch marks, and no indication that it had been left unattended overnight intentionally. We initially assumed that one of us must have forgotten to blow it out or something. After discussing it, we both agreed that neither of us had. I did research accidental candle reignition and learned about rare cases involving residual heat and flammable vapors and stuff like this, but those scenarios require a very specific condition and usually occur shortly after extinguishing, not several hours later. We ultimately dismissed it as something like this, and so we just sort of moved on. A few weeks after that, something else stood out though. In our spare bedroom, we keep a small display of vinyl records on 2 wall shelves. Each shelf holds 3 records, all upright in their sleeves. My partner is particular about their placement, and I avoid handling them all together. But one morning, one of the records on the lower shelf was partially overlapping the one beside it, as if it had been slid sideways. Now, it hadn't fallen, tilted forward, or slipped down or anything. The shelf is level and, it sat there still for a very long time before this. We did check for drafts, loose brackets, or shelf flex or something, but we didn't find anything. And again, we noted it and we just sort of moved on. The third incident happened recently, and this one was a bit different in nature. So we were sitting on the couch in the living room in the evening. Both of our cats were asleep beside us. In the corner of the room, there was a small metal stand holding coasters placed on top of a wooden cabinet that contains the electrical meter. And without any warning, both cats abruptly woke up and focused on that corner. And within seconds, the metal stand shifted several inches toward the wall. As it moved, some of the coasters slid off and hit the floor, and neither of us were near that cabinet. There was no visible vibration, no one walking past, and no appliances switching on at the time. This thing just sort of moved all on its own, so much so that the coasters fell out. Immediately afterward, both cats fled the room too. Their behavior was weird, raised fur, avoiding the area, and heightened startled response when touched for hours afterwards. This lasted for maybe 2 hours as well, which was really unusual for them. We again inspected the cabinet, the floor, and the stand afterward. The surface was dry and level. There's no wheels on anything, no loose screws, and no incline that would allow the object to slide on its own like this. We considered whether the cats could have caused it, but neither had been near the cabinet before it moved. Up until recently too, I would have confidently stated that unexplained household events always have mundane causes, even if they're not immediately obvious. But after living here for several months, I'm less certain of that position than ever. I'm still looking for explanations, practical ones obviously, but I can no longer say that nothing has happened here. So something has been bugging me as of late. I've experienced a lot of events of the paranormal throughout my life, but I've had a hard time trying to share experiences with people, mostly because I live in the South, I think. The problem with these creatures or things like ghosts is that it's hard to explain an experience without seeming like a crazy fool. However, I feel that it is time to share, and I want to connect to people who have had similar experiences with the unknown. I'll tell you now though that even with a large track number of running into these things, I am still heavily skeptical on what these are, and I always lean to try to disprove them. So, a few years ago, I decided to head out to the country to meet my friend. His name was Brandon. Brandon was a college buddy of mine who had quit college and had become a welder. He made some good cash at an early age and had a house built on his family's land too, which he wanted to show off to me during a nice sunny day. I won't lie too, I loved his place. His family owned a huge patch of acres and his place was built like the ultimate man cave. And anyway, after arriving, me and my old friend did the usual catching up and playing a few games on the PS4. Everything was normal until Brandon went out to get some beers and some pizza. He had left me alone to play some Mortal Kombat on his 75-inch 4K TV. It was normal for about 15 minutes of his departure until I heard running downstairs. I decided to look down the stairs to see what was happening, and I saw a little girl with frizzy black hair run past the bottom of the stairs, with Brandon's dog sitting at the middle of the stairs watching her run past too. I was like, cool, Brandon's kid's sister walked from his parents to his place to play or something. Honestly, I didn't think too much of it, as I had seen kids outside of his place playing outside before. Brandon returned with some Domino pizzas, some wings and some beer, and I decided to tell him what I saw, that his kid sister was running on the first floor. And the guy, he looked at me spooked. He said that he didn't have a kid sister and that the kids, they had left as soon as I pulled up. The weird part was that he got kind of excited and said, "Dude, you saw her too?" I had to make him explain. So Brandon told me a story that happened 3 weeks prior to me coming. He had some guys over drinking during the night, and they decided to crash in the room that we were in. As they slept on the floor, one of the guys started screaming, which prompted them all to roll over to see what was going on. And he said that there was this girl with black hair standing at the base of the stairs staring at them in the dark, and as soon as they saw her, she darted downstairs again. He stated that they turned the lights on and searched the place for her, all over the place, but she was nowhere to be seen. He was happy that I saw her because this means that to him, it was real. When I analyzed the event myself, I noticed that there wasn't a back door to the house that he built, and when the girl appeared, there was a lot of dust that sort of looked like smoke as she ran past the stairs. Usually ghosts or entities, they always seem to be made of this sort of smoke that has properties of like mist or something. Strangely though, she seemed so solid and full of saturation when she ran past. But what really made me think was noticing that the dog seemed so confused when he saw it too. This was honestly such a strange event. Also, they didn't live in a neighborhood or anything, so there were no neighbors. This whole event is still such a mystery to me, and I wish I had more answers. So this happened to my friend, not me, in 2007. To this day, she describes what she saw in the exact same as she had right after it happened, and can still clearly picture it as well. So, she was walking home from her friend's house at night. This is in a town in southern Oregon, in case that's important, but she doesn't remember the exact time, but says that it was definitely after midnight, and it was dark, so nobody else was out. She says that she was completely sober and not sleep deprived or anything. She was on her way home, and just about 2 blocks from her house, she was walking on the sidewalk along the main street and was crossing between 5th and 6th Street. Her house is on 7th. Across the street is a Safeway and a cemetery, and right then she noticed something about 50 feet ahead of her, crossing the street from the cemetery side to the side that she was on. And this is how she describes it. There were 2 creature things walking on their hind legs side by side. One was slightly shorter than the other, but they were both really tall, at least 7 feet. They were hunched over, lanky and extremely thin. She says that her immediate first thought was they looked almost like deer walking on their hind legs, but they didn't have any fur. It was more like a dark grayish skin. They held their arms and wrists kind of like how a T-Rex would, but their arms and hands were very long still, almost as long as their legs. When I asked, she said that she didn't see any tails. I asked her if they had hooves, and she says that she thinks so, but can't remember that part for certain. Everything was quiet, and she didn't hear them making any sounds on the pavement as they walked. I asked her if they had any antlers or deer-like shaped face, me thinking that maybe it actually was just hairless deer walking on their hind legs for some reason. She said no antlers though, and their heads were not shaped like a deer's or any animal, but more like a person's. She describes their faces as looking human, with human features, but something was just slightly off. She had frozen where she was as soon as she saw them. Everything was quiet and there were no cars driving by or anyone else around, which is pretty normal at night in our small town. But she says that she stood there kind of in shock. She watched as the two creatures slowly walked side by side, silently from across the street and over to the side of the street that she was on. She says that they didn't seem to see her at all, or if they did notice her, they didn't act at all like they did. She says that they acted as if they were simply a couple going on a casual night stroll together. She doesn't remember feeling any negative energy or vibes. She just felt fear because she was, pretty scared by what she saw. As soon as they finished crossing the street, they continued straight down 6th Street, and she couldn't see them after they passed the first house and kept walking down. At that point, she said that she snapped out of the shock and started running the one more block towards 6th Street to see where they were going. Once there, she turned down 6th Street to follow them, but at this point, they were completely gone. She doesn't know where they could have possibly gone that fast though, considering that they were just walking. They're not walking fast, but like I said, almost as if the two of them were just out on a casual night stroll. As soon as she realized that they had somehow disappeared out of nowhere though, she started running as fast as she could the one more block to her house on 7th Street. She told her mum and sister the next morning, and she says that these creatures were like nothing she had ever seen or heard of before. The closest thing that she could compare it to is a werewolf, like the one that Professor Lupin changes into the Harry Potter movies, hairless, super lanky and hunched over strangely. Except these ones had more human-like heads or faces than a wolf. She's only ever told her family and a few friends, me being one of them, about this. And also, she has no history of any mental illness or anything. But whenever I ask her about it, she describes it the exact same way, and is still pretty shook up when she thinks about it. Also, nothing like that has happened to her before or since then. Does anyone know what this could have been, though? I've heard about not deers on Reddit, but I'm not sure that that really fits because I think that those are more animal-like shaped and usually on all fours, right? If you guys have any questions, then I'm happy to ask her and get back to you. But any input would be greatly appreciated as both of us, I'll admit, are a bit lost. So I worked for Disney many years ago and was sent to take still photos of the Queen Mary for locations reference purposes. As part of the assignment, I was privately taken around the ship to various off-limits to the public areas by a very friendly and jovial security guard. We had been at it for about an hour when he took me up to the bridge. It was a cool autumn late afternoon and there was a slight breeze in the dusky air. The control room or wheelhouse was locked, so I wasn't able to go inside. Instead, I was taking photos of the interior through an exterior window. The security guard, who was with me, he got called to another part of the ship and had to leave me alone for a moment. He promised to return in about 15 minutes. Shooting through the window, I had my back to the captain's walk, which is where we came up from. I was looking through the camera viewfinder, which meant that I completely lost visual contact with what was immediately around me. Taking photos, I heard footsteps over my shoulder to my right, and I figured the security guard had returned. Then I felt a hand on my right shoulder, and obviously that completely startled me. I dropped the camera into my left hand and swung my right hand backward to brush away the security guard's hand, only to find that there was nobody there, just flags waving in the breeze and the quiet of the early evening. I shrugged the footsteps and the feeling of the hand on my shoulder off as a very convincing figment of my imagination. When the security guard eventually returned, I told him about what had happened, and his demeanor changed from jovial to quite serious. "Let's get out of here," he said, nervously. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that there were ghost stories about the captain's walk, that people have seen the former captain of the Queen Mary on the walk in the early evenings patrolling his bridge. And he also told me that some people reported feeling the presence of someone when nobody was there. Hearing that was enough for me too. I was more than happy to oblige our getting out of there and finishing the rest of the tour as quickly as possible. One of my earliest memories as a child is from one time my grandparents left me home alone effectively when I was 4 or 5. I was playing in my room with some toys when suddenly I noticed a man outside my window. For context, my childhood home had an enclosed patio which I could see from my window. He couldn't have just gotten in other words. At this point, I'm terrified and just stay in my room, but he soon simply enters it. I don't remember his appearance too well, but I remember I called him the chicken head man because he had a mohawk haircut. He doesn't say nor do anything. He just stands there catatonic, turns around and then leaves. I, being a stupid kid, decided to follow him. He truly wasn't doing anything. He was just sort of pacing through our hallway. He would walk to my grandfather's office, my mum's room, and my room, and then just repeat it. Eventually, I got bored of following him, and I just went to my room, and he didn't come back. I don't really remember how scared I was, but according to my parents, I was freaked out. But anyways, after this happens and my mum comes back home, I tell her about the chicken head man, and she is terrified. Turns out, she had been experiencing frequent night terrors where she would wake up and the same man would be sitting across the room staring at her. She decided that my encounter with him was enough proof that he was real, and she hired an exorcist to come and cleanse the house. And weirdly enough, I never had another encounter with the supernatural that I know of after that. This happened a long time ago, but the memory of it is still very much burned into me. I was young enough to still be sitting in those booster seats that you put your child in with the tray attachment for food. I was playing with a little toy car in the back seat of an old 1988 Honda Civic in my little car seat. We were on the road when suddenly and slowly a shadowy figure crossed over in front of me. The best way that I can describe it is that it was shaped like one of those Pac-Man ghosts, but black and with a pair of human-like eyes, no other facial features. It was small enough to fit on my kiddie tray thing that I was using as a race car track for my toy as it passed in front of me. Even then, I remember being freaked out since nothing in the car even remotely looked like that, nor could anything have reflected a shadow to look like what I had just seen. Of course, I immediately told my parents, who just simply brushed it off and didn't believe me. Even now, as I think of it more and more, I really still cannot explain it. The second time I saw it, it was a little while later. I can't remember how much later, but I know that I had outgrown the booster seat by this point, but was still sitting in the back of the car. I was climbing into the back seat of that car when I saw it again. Only this time it was on the seats and much bigger than before, tall enough to cover the whole middle seat in its shadow. It was positioned almost as if it was looking out from behind the shadow being cast by the driver's seat, and only one eye showed this time. I completely lost it though, and quickly ran from that car to my parents' confusion. Now, I knew that this couldn't possibly be a shadow being cast from something already in the car, and when I finally worked up the courage to look again with my parents, it was gone. To this day, I haven't had any paranormal encounters nearly as weird as that one. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or spirits, but even I can't begin to explain what it was that I saw then. That was the last time that I saw that ghost or whatever it was, and shortly after that, my father gave away that car to a friend of his. I don't know if ghosts can haunt cars or whatever, but if they can, then that car was for sure haunted. This isn't my first encounter in my life, but it definitely was the most convincing. I was in Okinawa for a few months, but one day some friends and I decided to go see Shuri Castle. It had burned down a while ago, so there wasn't much to see anymore, but we decided to go anyway. While wandering around, we came across these steps that led down to a pond. So we headed down to check it out when I noticed this path over to the left. I decided to follow it because, why not? And I noticed this hole, or maybe like an old entry into a room of some sort. It was barred up so you couldn't walk into it, but while I was looking, I noticed this dark mass. The room itself was already dark, but this mass was noticeably darker. I could also see a very strong energy coming from it, sort of, but after trying to figure out what it was for a few seconds, I called my friend over to see if he noticed it too. He said that he couldn't see anything, but when I tried to point it out, it sort of rushed me. At this point, I get chills throughout my entire body, and I begin feeling extremely sad all of a sudden, like I'm about to cry. My buddy noticed this change in me, and we honestly started laughing about the situation since it was kind of crazy, to be honest. We end up walking away and continuing down the main path towards the pond. I couldn't shake this feeling, though, of whatever I just encountered that it gave me. So on our way back, I decided to take another look, but this time it rushed me instantly, and it was there again. I turned around and went back to the main path, but whatever it was, it stayed with me. I began feeling like my energy was leaving my body, to the point that I had to sit in the middle of the path because I felt like I was about to pass out. I kept telling whatever it was to go away, that it wasn't allowed to follow me, but it wasn't listening, that's for sure. The rest of the day we spent in Naha, I just couldn't shake this thing too. Even when we got back to where we were staying, all night I could feel it watching me while I was trying to sleep. I asked my friend's wife, who was a local, to see if I could get a cleansing anywhere, and thankfully, she was able to help me out. It was just a really freaky situation and experience, and the energy that it gave off was extremely powerful, whatever it was. I've never felt something like that before, and I really hope to never encounter anything like it again. Back in 2018, I was 17 around that time. I was living in foster care. The group home was situated on a busy street, and despite living in the city, we had a backyard, basketball court, picnic table, and at the very back we even had some grass. The whole backyard, it was surrounded by 2-meter tall chain link fences. There were houses to the right and the left of ours. At the very back of the yard, on the other side of the fence, there was a public walking or biking path that stretched at least a dozen kilometers. This path, it would take you through this huge park, along the water, to the beach, etc. It was a very popular area for people to visit too. Now, I was a regular cannabis smoker, although I was always very well put together for a teenager. The group home workers agreed to turn a blind eye on me as long as I didn't make it obvious. So on weekend mornings, I'd go for a walk to the park behind the house. I'd roll up on a park bench and I would smoke. But one day, everything changed. It was a weekend morning as usual at 7 a.m. I made my way to my favorite park bench. I'm sitting there with my joint in my hand. It was quite windy and it kept lighting out. I was facing the water, about 100 meters of field between the waterfront and I, when I noticed a man stomping through the field, heading straight for me. He didn't seem like he was on a leisurely walk at all. I remember thinking to myself, 1, why is he not using the paved path? 2, why does it seem like he's walking straight towards me? 3, what is he holding? 4, is anybody else around? And at all that, panic ensued. He was holding something chunky in one of his hands. I looked around for someone, noticed an elderly woman walking from the direction of the group home. She was about 20 meters away from me, and I sped walk towards the woman. By the time that I got to her, the man, he had made it to the bench that I was sitting on. The woman kept walking towards the bench, and I in the opposite direction. For a moment, I looked back to make sure the man wasn't following me, or worse. I see the man lay his brick down on a pile of rocks behind the bench. The woman stopped walking. I'm guessing that she had processed something peculiar was going on too. Thankfully, the man kept moving straight towards the boulevard and was no longer to be seen in the park. The woman, she then turns around and she looks at me with this sort of shocked stare in her eyes, and I remember feeling reassured by that. We both continued on with our days without saying a single word. But the same day at around 9 p.m, people aren't allowed to smoke within 10 meters of an entry to an establishment, and there was only one light in the backyard, so it was above the entry to the establishment, and this girl in my group home goes out for a smoke in the backyard, no lights on. And like 3 minutes later, she's banging on the door yelling, so I let her in obviously. She's freaking out. We're trying to get answers out of her, but it's hard. Then she explains that there was a man. He stood there on the path allegedly. She watched and stared, taking pulls of a cigarette. The man then starts walking towards her and starts climbing the fence. That's when I shared my story from that same morning. To be honest, I thought that I was just being paranoid at first, but when I heard that somebody had tried to hop the fence, and the guy was described to look very similar to the person that I saw, I truly believe that it was the same man. The workers on the shift that night, they called the police, and the police started patrolling the path at night. The group home added some garden lights in the back, and honestly, I just hope that this person never lays hands on anyone, because that wild look in his eyes, if he does, I really don't like to think about what might happen.